currently my favourite studio piece of equipment is probably the machine, because it's, well, not only made my life easier. I mean, I've got sort of 808s and loads of different drum machines, but I think for sort of more contemporary production and the sort of malleability of what you can do with machine, it's pretty interesting. It has a lot of the sort of settings for recreating old drum sounds and sample rates and various bits and pieces on it, but also sort of the ease of loading samples outside of just using the samples that are built into stuff like the 808, etc, etc. It's a really cool piece of kit. It's great, actually. I think I've turned quite a few people onto it. A friend of mine, Richard X, actually used to use MPCs. I think he had a couple of them rigged up, and he's now completely converted to machine. And yeah, it is. I don't know whether it's a kind of easy, me being lazy, the whole concept of not having to get the MIDI running and all of those things. But yeah, it's really cool, and there's some interesting developments with it afoot as well.
Living as the young do.
So my the setup here is primarily the DAW, which I'm using. I've just moved over to Cubase 7 actually. Been with Cubase from day one of producing, from the Atari days, and I've just by default stuck with them. But the actual new Cubase 7 is they're slowly sort of becoming, I think, one of the most sort of interesting DAWs outside of Logic and Pro Tools, of which I've got both. But yeah, I just kind of end up with Cubase. And then within the computer itself, I have two UAD2 cards, a quad core and a duo, and run all the UAD plugins, thanks to Universal Audio. But which is great because there's such a vast range of just real analog sounding. They just get it really right. So it's yeah, I've again been with them forever, and just the way they keep introducing new things, recently Shadow Hills, and now sort of guitar, soft tube, stuff like that is really spot on. So then machine, which is connected straight in, and then I use machine as a actually inside the DAW itself, but I use the pads to program drums in. And then coming out from all of that, Apogee Ensemble sound card, and then a Mackie 16 I've got, which is purely my sort of tracking / patch bay for all the outboard. And then from the sort of basic sort of instances of recording vocals and various different synths, I've got the API Lunchbox with the mic pre, which is my sort of one of my favourite piece of recording equipment. And that's all patched through into the live room, where I have various different mics and kind of bits and pieces and setups in there. And then after that, we move on to listening, which is PMCs, which again with me and Justin Harris bought years ago. I've been using those, and I've just upgraded them along the way, and my ears are sort of used to them, so I kind of swear by them. And then for sort of near field reference, the Avantones, which are just no crossover, really basic, simple sounding, so it's good to just get mid-range and stuff like that. Depends on what I'm producing. For dance music, they're not quite so relevant, but for other stuff, home listening, they're really cool. And then we get on to keyboards, things just collected along the way, some of it sort of mine and Justin's from Freaks days, the Nord, which I still use, have several cards in the back, and I still love it actually. The Pro 1, which I've had serviced numerous times, but and still find it doing things that I've never heard it do before. So that's a favourite, one of my favourites. 101, again, something I've had for years, does certain things really well, it's got a really distinct sound. The MS-10, which is again a really distinct sound, but something that I really kind of enjoy, especially sort of CV gating up and linking things together. Juno 106, another old school house favourite, currently in a little disrepair. I've got to buy a new circuit board voice chip for it, but interestingly with the voice chip it does some weird distorted stuff which I quite like at the moment. Poly 800, it's got some great little presets on it, don't tend to use it quite so much anymore. CS1, which has got a really sort of distinct single sound. It doesn't really do a whole lot. I use it a lot for noise and running guitars through and stuff like that to use the filters. The microkorg, an old Freaks thing that we've just stuck with and kept it here. I use it occasionally for bits and pieces, but it's a bit more of a museum piece really now. Generally I start with drums. I mean, usually it's the things that kind of in my head of songs or ideas for songs, so things that, you know, I'd like to write a song about or how it sounds. So I usually kind of come up with pretty much the whole thing in my head and then try and translate that somewhere or another, whether it be start with the tempo and then the drums and work on the drums and then from there start to build the layers of music, etc, etc. But yeah, usually a drum beat. I have to come in with an idea. I think actually just sitting in here and trying to suddenly think of something is probably the most negative way of any form of creativity. I think anyone generally, you know, you wouldn't sit, I mean, unless you kind of sat at a piano and just noodling away. I'm fortunate enough to have a piano in the house and I'll come up with something and it will trigger something, but then I don't like to just go and write an instrumental unless I'm making club music designed for clubs, which will usually be, the whole project will be conceptual, but if it's an actual song then I need to have something to write about first before I even get into it. Well, this moved from the original studio we were in, so from things that me and Justin originally bought sort of as Freaks, I think the things that I've still got, other than the Atari running Cubase, which I've still got up in the roof, we borrowed, actually starting off we borrowed a lot of things. We had, at one point we had Matthew Herbert's mixing desk, which was in a Mackie, and some other bits and pieces from John Marsh, and then our first sort of big purchase when we started to make some money, or actually get some money for records and remixes, was probably the Nord, and maybe the bass station and the drum station. I think those were the two original sort of members of the Freaks equipment. And then when I went on to sort of do a lot more stuff on my own when Justin moved to Cornwall, I think my sort of big purchases would have probably been the computer and then maybe the API.